Hello and welcome to this mini lecture at the virtual open day for the School of Geographical Sciences, University of Bristol. My name is Ed Atkins and I'm a lecturer at the department, and I'm going to be providing a taster session for you all today. It's around 10 minutes of me talking through one of the concepts that we'll be studying in the first year of your time here. In particular, we're going to be discussing political geography and one of the topics of your first assignments at the department. Political geography is a term that you may well have come across in your GCSEs and A-levels. Taken broadly, it's the study of how power is spatial, or how space, where things happen in the world, is political. Now, I don't mean political as in party politics here, like Labour or Conservative, but because these spaces, where we live and work and socialise, have been designed and produced by certain processes and decisions that are political, and as a result, characterised by power and power asymmetry. As a result, they can often reinforce or reinscribe or destabilise certain ways of seeing the world and all those who live in it. The relationship between power in political, economic, social or cultural terms and the spaces that we live in, work in, where we see our friends in, where we go for dinner, where we take our daily walk, are multiscalar. In other words, these spaces at the local and individual levels exist within a wider chain of interaction between the international, national, regional, and then the local and individual. Sadly, we can see this at the moment more than ever with the coronavirus pandemic, in which case global policies and global challenges are directly changing how we experience space and our everyday lives at the local level. But it can involve different variables as well, including economics, territory, nationalism, and climate and the environment, as well as culture and religious or spiritual belief. But it leads very often to outcomes that are not felt the same way in different spaces and by different people. We might label these as spatially uneven outcomes when the impacts of certain events and episodes and processes are not felt equally across all members of our community. Now, this can be seen in environmental terms with communities across the globe, highlighting how they are facing pollution, environmental degradation and climate change impacts where many others are not, even though very often these communities are the least responsible for climate change. And then in turn, our own similarities or differences at the individual level in terms of class, gender or race are related to much wider structural issues at the regional, national and international levels that all influence how we experience these links and may in turn result in different outcomes at the individual level. But our actions at the individual level can also constitute what happens at other levels. Think here of how what we do, what we buy, how we might vote, all influences carbon emissions and climate change policy. Now in the next few slides, I'm going to be taking some examples from the city of Bristol, which is dotted with sites and buildings and locations that all help us understand these links. Now Bristol as a city is dotted with reminders of its history in global trade, from Corn Street, where merchants used to meet, negotiate and make deals, and Queen Square, where many of them lived, to the old Vic Theatre, which was paid for members of this merchant community and traders. Within these buildings, we can see how much of the Bristolian cityscape is influenced by its relationship with national and global political economy. And this is particularly in one form of trade. While Bristol has an historic trading relationship with the rest of the UK, being a key trading port for much of its history, trading in agricultural goods and wool and woad, which is a blue dye, and it provided a fulcrum of trade between the interior of the United Kingdom and the European continent. But when we talk about Bristol's trading history, we often talk about its role in the transatlantic slave trade. As a quick summary, the slave trade was part of a network of trade which existed between Britain, West Africa and the Caribbean, in which this kind of triangle was formed between Western Europe, the shipping of goods from Western Europe to the African coast, the shipping of people, slaves from the African coast to the Americas, and the shipping of goods back from the Americas to Europe. Now ultimately, this led to the upheaval, forced transportation and enslavement of close to 12 million people between 1501 and 1866, around 2 million of whom are estimated to have tragically died en route. The British economy was transformed by the Atlantic slave trade. British overseas trade grew substantially during the 18th century when this trade was at its peak. Data derived from customs records indicates that the official value of British exports rose almost sixfold over the century, whilst imports increased over fivefold. So this is a major moment in the economic development and history of the country, particularly in terms of its relationship to the Industrial Revolution, which we'll be discussing in your first year here. Bristol's participation in the slave trade stretches at least as far back as the 11th century, in which Irish and English slaves were routinely sold in the port from this time onwards. But Bristol's official involvement in what became known as the transatlantic slave trade started in 1698, when the London-based Royal African Company's monopoly on the trade was ended. A few Bristol ships had been licensed to engage in trade of slaves in West Africa previously, as early as 1690, and there's little doubt that Bristol ships traded illegally in slaves well before then. By the late 1730s, Bristol had become Britain's premier slaving port, rivalled only by Liverpool. Many Bristolians profited from this slave trade. Not only shipbuilders and slavers, but also merchants, tradespeople, and manufacturers, all involved in that triangular trade from the previous slide. Small investors could buy a share in a slaving voyage, and profits could be made at every point of the triangular trade. Famous names of Bristol, such as the Colstons, the Tyndalls, the Farrs, were directly involved in the trade, whilst other famous historical families of the city, such as the Brights, the Smythes, the Pinneys, all owned West Indian plantations where slaves were forced to work. The map on the slide shows sites in Bristol that are linked to slavery in some way, be it via property ownership or otherwise. Street names such as Guinea Street, Jamaica Street, Codrington Place, Tyndall's Park, Worrell and Stapleton Road recall the city's involvement with Africa and the West Indies. The profitable exploits of wealthy ex-planters allowed them to build the outstanding Georgian houses which distinguish Clifton from its surrounding areas. Now Clifton is famously the well-to-do, the upmarket neighbourhood in Bristol. After Bristol's decline as a slave port, Clifton had one of the highest rates of retired West Indian planters in Britain. Now this map shows that the spaces of Bristol are tied to this global political economy of trade and commerce, and with it, the transatlantic slave trade. The trade leading to the building of much of the city and the landmarks and names that we associate with it even today. Now, place differs from space. Many of you would have covered this previously, but just in case, places are sites that have been given cultural meaning by the people who inhabit them. In geographical kind of thinking, this could be a monument. It could be a place where people go to sit, a park where people have their lunch on a warm day. It could be a place of religious importance, where people go on pilgrimage. Or it could be a university where students study and socialise. But place is also political. It may have contested meanings, or its meaning may become disputed as time goes by. And we see that in Bristol currently. A name which is particularly difficult to avoid in Bristol is Edward Colston. His name is brandished across the city with great pride. It labels statues and schools and streets and music venues and even church windows. But Colston is often at the centre of a discussion of the legacy of the transatlantic slavery in Bristol. And in particular, his statue seen on the screen and in the centre of Bristol is something of a lightning rod for protests about Bristol's relationship with slavery. His face has been daubed white, and an unofficial plaque has been regularly placed and quickly removed to inform people about his role in the slave trade. In 2018, the decision was made to install a very similar plaque explaining that Edward Colston was a major player in the creation of the transatlantic slave trade. However, it proved challenging to get people to agree upon the wording of such a plaque to be put on Colston's plinth, and the debate rumbled on for 2 more years. That was until the 7th of June 2020, and a dramatic event during the Black Lives Matter protests in Bristol. During these protests, protesters tore Colston's statue from its plinth, transported him down the harbour, and threw him into the water. This act has created a great deal of controversy and debate both within Bristol and the wider UK about the country's history of the transatlantic slave trade and empire. However, it also represents an act of radical placemaking in which protests take a place and transform it, raising wider questions of the location's role within wider politics of power. And lastly, before I let you go on and enjoy the rest of your days, I just want to signpost this. Spaces change over time. These images are of the same view, of St Mary Redcliffe Church in Bristol. You can see there's 200 years separating the two images. The reason why the one on the left doesn't have a steeple is due to damage experienced in a fire. But you can see here how narrow streets gave way to wide roads and roundabouts, which illustrate the presence of cars as a dominant mode of transport. And then this next image shows the church from another angle. You can see the church in the mid-left of the top image. And at the bottom is a recently proposed transformation of this area into a pedestrianised route, showing our changing attitudes to both cars as a dominant form of transport, but also shared space between cyclists and pedestrians and vegetation and greenery. It's these topics and these elements of Bristol, they're both past and present, that we're going to be exploring in your first term at geography in Bristol. We're going to be peeling back the layers of both what Bristol is today and what it was in the past. This isn't to make us kind of feel shame or confusion of the city that we call or will call home, but is instead to build up an understanding of how everything we experience at the local and individual level is tied to processes at the international, national, regional, local and individual levels, and how that is often tied to questions of power and politics. If you have any questions or want just to have a chat, feel free to email me. My email is on the screen. I hope you'll have lovely days and to catch up with you soon. Take care. Bye.